The Passion of the Christ movie review. So this is one of the scripted movie review series, which I've been going back through my blog archives and kind of resurrecting a lot of my old book and movie reviews and turning them into YouTube videos, for better or for worse. So this one especially is a little bit dated because it's one of those movies which was such a big deal when it came out. Everyone was talking about it, and then people have kind of more or less completely forgotten about it. So bear with me here, or don't, skip the video. But you're going to have to go and kind of go back to 2004 and imagine the controversy behind this movie. So, right, where to begin with this one? I guess, first of all, I was living in Japan at the time, and everything got released late in Japan. I'm not quite sure why this was. I think it was kind of a marketing strategy. So, there was kind of money and attention that Hollywood would turn on marketing to different countries and different markets. And I think maybe they thought they didn't have kind of enough people to run their marketing campaign worldwide simultaneously. Now, I've not been in Japan for a number of years, but I'm still living abroad here. And I think they've kind of dropped this. And I suspect they dropped it because of the internet and piracy. And it was kind of no longer possible to control this stuff. So if you have like a big blockbuster movie and it gets released in the US and it doesn't get released for another 6 months in Japan, then people will be like, well, I'm not waiting 6 months, I'll just download it now. So I think everything kind of gets released simultaneously now. Back in 2004, you had to wait. So the effect was, this movie came out in February 2004. All my friends were seeing it, everyone was blogging about it, or there was no Facebook back in those days, but emailing about it, all these newspaper articles, and I really wanted to chime in with my 2 cents, because I've got a lot of opinions on politics and religion, but I had to wait until the thing came out in Japan, and then I finally saw it in, I think, May in Japan when it came out here. And that was one of my primary reasons for wanting to see it, even though the thing had kind of gotten negative reviews, is just kind of wanting to chip in my 2 cents and participate in the cultural conversation. But I was also kind of interested in it just in and of itself. So I had grown up in religious environments. I guess most people do, but this was going to kind of Christian schools and church a few times a week and kind of getting a very thorough biblical education. And I had an interest in the Bible stories at the time, and even though I've kind of moved towards more of an agnostic, I still maintain an interest in this. I'm still interested in the Bible as a work of mythology or literature or an insight into history or what have you. These kind of are still my interests. I've kind of moved more skeptical as the years have gone on. In 2004, when this movie came out, I was an agnostic, but I was more kind of on the credible side of an agnostic. I was saying, well, maybe there is something to religion. Now I'm kind of on the maybe not side of the spectrum, although these things are inherently unstable. It depends what time of day you catch me at as to where my exact feelings are. But I was still kind of inclined maybe to feel a little bit of reverence for this kind of story back at the time. So one of the big things that I was hearing over and over again in the news or on the internet before I got around to seeing this movie myself was people were upset about the blood curse. So there's a line in the Gospel of John where Pontius Pilate washes his hands and he says, okay, I've washed my hands of him. His blood is on you. And the Jews say, okay, yes, his blood is on us and on our children. And that's been used over the many centuries since to kind of justify a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, Christian Europe, saying, well, maybe in the US as well, but kind of over this sweep of history, primarily in Europe, to say that all Jews were kind of tainted by this blood curse. And people were really upset at Mel Gibson for leaving that in the movie. Now, as somebody who kind of self-identified with kind of the more leftist or liberal end of the ideological spectrum, I was, felt like I was kind of on that side of it where I was with the people who were criticizing Mel Gibson because Mel Gibson was a right-wing jerk. At the same time, though, I do have to admit, I understood it kind of. And this, again, comes back to something I've talked about in a few different videos, is my completist personality. Like, I don't like taking stuff out. I like leaving all the details in. Even the stuff that's problematic, I don't like taking stuff out. So I can understand the argument that, it's problematic, but it's in the text. If you're making a film based on the Gospel of John, and this is in the Gospel of John, then what are you going to do? Censor it? Take it out? And yeah, obviously people would say yes. But I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea of, hopefully nobody believes this now. But why don't just leave it in and then maybe have a conversation about it rather than taking it out and pretending it doesn't exist. Hopefully I'm not going to get in trouble for this sentiment. I'm not saying it's good. It's not good now. It wasn't good 2,000 years ago when it got written into the gospel. But it's there. So why pretend it's not there? I don't know. The thing with that, though, to kind of argue against myself, if you say, okay, well, it's in the text, so we've got to leave it in because we're being faithful to the text. If that's your argument, then you've got to leave everything in. Because the moment you start editing, the moment you kind of start making choices and kind of picking out stuff, then that argument falls apart. Then you say, okay, well, you left out this detail, so why couldn't you have left out that detail? So I got a couple blog posts out of the Passion of the Christ. One post was before I even saw it, whereas I was recounting a conversation in which I was kind of discussing this very thing. And I said, I'm going to go to that movie and I'm going to watch to see if they leave anything out. And I felt like I knew my Bible quite well, kind of growing up in a solid kind of religious background, that I could kind of, know a lot of those little details about kind of nitpicky stuff that might otherwise get left out. I remember thinking kind of my litmus test as I was thinking about that little detail about John Mark in the Garden of Gethsemane. So in the Gospel of Mark, there's a little note where when the guard sees Jesus, there's also a young man, and they try and grab him as well. And he just kind of runs away, and the Roman soldiers grab his clothes, but he just kind of slips out of his clothes and runs naked. It's never identified who that is in the Gospel of Mark, but it's church tradition to associate that with John Mark. I thought, okay, let me... that's one of those little things that could easily be left out. I'm going to kind of watch the movie, see if they kind of include those kind of details. And I watched the movie, and actually they did include something brief, which I think was an allusion to that John Mark thing. So that kind of took the wind out of the sails from my argument. Something I wasn't so sharp on back then, but maybe would be more sharp on now, is all the different contradictions in the crucifixion account. which again, if you're kind of putting these into one narrative, you've got to smooth stuff over, and that's also a form of editing. In my defense, I knew about the contradictions in the resurrection account because we had had kind of some Sunday school lessons on that and how they could be smoothed out or not. I hadn't at that time read a lot about the contradictions in the crucifixion account, although I've since kind of brushed up on that with kind of Bart Ehrman and kind of some other histories I've read or books I've read on that. Yeah, the other thing, this was kind of a cultural war at the time, where secular people were criticizing this movie, and religious people were like, you don't understand, this isn't a movie, it's a religious experience, you're kind of criticizing it all wrong. And I remember because I went to see this movie in the theaters, and you buy your ticket, and then you walk by the concession stand, you know, where you get your popcorn and your Coca-Cola and your candy. And I always get like a big thing of popcorn whenever I go to the movie theater. It's just my tradition. Or it used to be. I'm a little bit healthier now. And a big thing of Coca-Cola. And it just kind of doesn't feel like the movies without like the popcorn and Coca-Cola. And I was walking by that concession stand and I thought, am I going to be drinking Coke and eating popcorn while I watch Jesus Christ get crucified on the movie screen? Like, how sacrilegious is that? And at that moment, it just kind of clicked to me how inappropriate it was to have a movie like this in the theaters. I think if you want to make the argument that this movie is supposed to be a religious experience, not entertainment, take it out of the movie theaters. I mean, show it at a church screening or something like that. But if it's in the movie theaters, it's kind of getting viewed as entertainment. I don't know. It's also, yeah, it's just terribly awkward. I ended up making a compromise with myself where I bought the popcorn and the Coke, but I said to myself, okay, I'm going to just eat these during the first half of the movie, and when we get to Jesus Christ nailed on the cross, I'm not going to be eating popcorn while I watch that. I don't know. Hopefully, I don't know if I've added any years to my time in purgatory for that compromise or whatever. And another thing, I'm going random here and jumping from thought to thought. But another reason I wanted to see this movie is because I was interested in the story. Now, growing up, you know, you hear this story over and over and over again, especially kind of in the church, right? Every Easter or every Good Friday, you have the sermon, you hear about it. I went to a couple Passion plays when I was young. It is more of a Catholic thing than a Protestant thing historically, but there was an interest in kind of bringing it in at some of the churches around us. So we went to a couple of them, and I would have felt bad saying this as a kid, but I just found it so boring. You know, you go to one station of the cross, you read the scripture verse, you see it enacted, you say a little prayer, go to another one. It just kind of seemed to suck the life out of the story. And then, when I was in college, or actually a little bit before that, when I was about 17 in high school, I saw Jesus Christ Superstar. Or actually, I listened to the album first. I found the album, was a big fan of the album, was a big fan of the movie. Part of that is just because I'm just kind of like the music, and I know not everybody does, but I was a big fan of kind of rock musicals from that era, the early 70s, late 60s. I really like the music, and I also thought, as I watched it, boy, this is an interesting story. You know, you have this turbulent time in history, kind of the colonialist, imperialist Romans, Jews who are rebelling against it, kind of revolutionary time in history, dare I say. And then you have kind of Jesus going around doing his thing, but the Romans don't really understand what he's doing. The Jews don't understand what he's doing. The people around him don't understand what he's doing. And then even within his own camp, one of them ends up betraying them. Peter ends up denying him 3 times. And I thought, watching this, I thought, why did I ever think this was a boring story? This is a really fascinating story. It's got all these elements of drama in it. Now, Jesus Christ Superstar is not a Christian interpretation. They take some stuff in the Bible and twist it a little bit, but they're largely kind of taking the same narrative that's in the Bible. That idea of kind of Jesus not being understood by the people around him is in the Bible. That idea of the tension between the Jews and the Romans is in the Bible. I mean, it's also in Josephus, which is sometimes where more of that comes in. Like if you go to see like a dramatization of it. But it's in the Bible a bit. And they kind of just change things a little bit. So Jesus is kind of this person kind of caught up in his own cult of superstardom that he can no longer control. And I guess that's in the Bible somewhat. I mean, I was going to say that's not really the biblical view, but you do get the sense that Jesus has this following around him, and they're not getting it, and he's trying to explain it to them, and you do get a sense a little bit maybe from the biblical narrative that he's losing control of the crowds. Maybe. Anyways, I watched that and I thought, this is really an interesting story. And maybe the music kind of carried you along. If you're really into dramatic music, it makes it feel more dramatic than it really is. So I thought this could be done as an interesting story, which was another reason I was curious to see the Passion of the Christ and the drama behind it. But it was just really boring. And I guess that's my review. It was just really boring. But I'll read out what I had written down at the time. So from the 2004 review. It says, I've been reading with interest about the controversy this film had caused back home. So when I found out it was now released in Japan, I came out the next day to see it. I had wanted to weigh in on the issue for a long time ago, but I was trying to restrain myself from forming an opinion until after I had seen the movie. Of course, as with a lot of the political social commentary I put on this blog, my timeliness has been handicapped by the fact that I live in Japan. I know this is old news now in the States, and everyone is talking about other movies now. But I thought I'd post my 2 cents here anyways. So as I noted in a previous entry, I did have some criticisms in my mind before I even saw the movie. But the wind was kind of taken somewhat out of my sails by the fact that the film actually didn't include the blood curse. Now, I could have sworn I read in a Washington Post article, among other places, that the blood curse was included in this movie, and that was kind of one of the big controversies. But I was watching for it the whole time and I never saw it. Now, somebody actually emailed me after I wrote that and said, apparently I'd missed this, but it was in the movie, because they did the movie in kind of the original languages, or what they thought was the original languages. It was in the movie in the Aramaic, but they did not translate it with the English subtitles. So it was in the movie, but they didn't translate it, apparently. Anyways, moving on. Some of you know I'm a big fan of the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. I admit this somewhat sheepishly because it is kind of a guilty pleasure. As with any musicals, the music is probably the most important thing, and I'm guilty of liking kind of these rock musicals from the 60s and 70s. I also really like Hair and Tommy, other stuff that came out at about that time. As with everyone else who was raised Christian, I was very familiar with the story of the crucifixion, and I had seen numerous church passion plays growing up, and I always thought they were so boring. They were trying to emotionally drain the audience as much as possible in an attempt to make you realize the sufferings of Christ. I think Jesus Christ Superstar helped me realize for the first time what an exciting story the whole thing really was. I mean, here was Jesus. He was born into a politically turbulent time. He outraged the existing religious authorities. He was surrounded by people who didn't understand him, and even his closest followers didn't get it. He was betrayed by one of his own. He saw all of his support fall away from him, and at the end, both his disciples kind of denied him, and the crowd betrayed him, turned away from him. You know, that story was always there, but the Christian passion plays or Christian Sunday school movies I saw, they always just made it so reverent and boring and sermonizing that it just killed the drama. Jesus Christ Superstar was able to do away with all that sermonizing and just made it a really exciting story. I mean, if you think about it, the actual story itself is interesting. Unfortunately, Mel Gibson's movie, like some of the other passion plays I've seen when I was younger, seemed determined to sap all the life out of the drama. Every moment seems to be overacted, overemphasized, and over-emotionalized. This is true right from the beginning, in the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas betrays Jesus, and Peter subsequently cuts off the ear of one of the guards, only to have Jesus rebuke him and heal the man. Now, this was potentially an exciting scene, but they just killed it. The slow motion, the long close-ups, the sappy music, they all seem to rob the story of what could have been a very vivid, exciting scene if the director was determined not to drain every emotion out of it. This was also true of the long walk to Calvary as well. All the sad music, all the slow motion, it just seemed overkill, boring. And like a lot of people, I was left wondering what the whole point of the movie was. I mean, it didn't seem like an effective missionary tool. You could show this movie to people who weren't Christians, and they'd just say, well, what's the point of that? I mean, surely if the point was to convert people, you could have the movie focusing on Jesus' life and, his teachings. Or you could have it focus on the resurrection, right? How Jesus kind of conquered death. But why have the whole movie just focused on the suffering of the cross? What do we get out of that? It could have been that this movie is aimed at the faithful. So it's not meant to convert people. It's just meant for people who are already Christians to have a religious experience. But if that was the case, why put it in the theaters? Why not screen it at local churches instead? I mean, I know it wouldn't have made much money, and this is a big budget Hollywood production, so it's got to make back its money. But am I the only one who had a moral dilemma at the concession stand? I mean, normally I buy popcorn when I'm at the movie theater. But did I really want to be munching on popcorn and drinking Coca-Cola while I watched Jesus be crucified? That really seemed inappropriate to me. Perhaps, and I'm just throwing this out as an idea, the debate over this movie is an example of a larger phenomenon in American culture wars, in which religious conservatives are so eager to put Christian images in prominent places, they don't think about whether this is actually kind of serving God or not. I mean, is God truly being glorified when we force unbelievers to recite the Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance? This had been another kind of political issue that year, I think. Somebody had gone to court to get Under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance. Been a big culture war. Or the debate over Jesus' pictures in public schools. Sometimes I think Jesus doesn't really care if his picture is displayed in public schools or not. Or this whole debate about the Ten Commandments being in the courtrooms, etc., etc., etc. I think with this movie, The Passion of the Christ, Some religious conservatives were so excited to have a box office hit about the crucifixion that many of them didn't stop to think if it was appropriate. Now, you'll notice I'm qualifying my remarks with some. I'm aware that actually a lot of religious people, religious conservatives even, did have some of these concerns and did make them public. At any rate, it's funny seeing this movie in Japan, which is a place where people are traditionally very ignorant of Christianity. I mean, there are some Christians in Japan, but by and large, your average Japanese person is not nearly as familiar with the Christian mythos as, the Bible stories as an American would be. So after viewing the movie, I spent the next hour trying to just answer all the questions from a Japanese friend and trying to explain it. But yeah, such a graphic and bloody movie is that the best way to introduce Japanese people to Christianity? I don't know, the whole thing was kind of strange.